My name is Jessica Luther Rummel. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of North Texas, and I am currently researching and have been for the last 3 years researching the philosophical and theo-mythical histories of white supremacy, in particular focused on the way that white supremacist culture has developed in Denton County over the last 200 years. So if you attended my lecture last week, I began addressing the earliest Anglo settlements in North Texas during the 1840s to explain how Denton was founded on the principles of theological white supremacy. I explained how the earliest community was established by white settlers in pursuit of a theo-mythologically pure white society, and who employed brutal campaigns of violence designed to forcibly remove indigenous and black communities. We explored how after the Civil War, while Ku Klux Confederate elites continued to enslave and victimize black persons as they retained control over local civic institutions. We discussed how local federal Reconstruction efforts were vehemently opposed by white elites and how they sought to challenge the racial hierarchy, how they sought to target those who challenged the racial hierarchy, black and white, though of course black persons and indigenous persons faced the most egregious retributions. Most importantly, last week we addressed how after the turn of the 20th century, white supremacists continued to preserve their privileges with commemorations to white power and counter-historical narratives that minimize the atrocities of the past, and as communities of color achieved progress of their own without white endorsement, the second-generation Klan was conjured by the efforts of local UDC and Confederate veterans to displace and disappear blacks because their very presence threatened the white moral order. So by revitalizing the theomyths of their ancestors, we explored how the 1920s Klan went on to normalize white supremacist culture with a distinct brand of racial language that continues to thrive in our modern culture. So today, I'd like to begin by emphasizing the extent to which the 1920s Klan revitalization movement affected the overall social and political culture of Denton via the normalization of this distinctly racialized discourse and segregationist efforts, which were prominent throughout the first half of the 20th century. Because Klansmen in Denton remained prominent religious and cultural influencers. They were the teachers, they were the politicians, they were the pastors, they were the librarians, they were the white elite. And so by consciously and unconsciously engaging with the cultural apparatuses around them, Klan members in Denton infiltrated every aspect of the local community, and I can't emphasize that more. So while the Klan's message and activities certainly weren't condoned by all whites in Denton, for every person who condemned the order, others sanitized and normalized Klanishness. So as a deep-rooted cultural movement that manifests itself organically, we have to understand the 1920s Klan as a collection of white supremacists who shared a lived ideology. And this lived ideology was expressed through these local civic and cultural institutions. Now, I discussed last week how Klanish culture thrived in Denton's churches, politics, the civic and academic institutions, as well as fraternal and social clubs. And I talked about how by the close of the 1920s, Klan members were not a minority population. They were everyday Protestant American citizens. They were the new normal. And I suggested that Denton was a hub of Klanish culture. And the truth is, Denton's order never truly died. Rather, it continued its function through its unique racialized language and by way of its covert infiltrations into the local socio-civic institutions, which afforded the movement its greatest achievement, its influence on the American political conscience, which redefined both Americanness and un-Americanness. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more about Klan language and supremacist language and discourse. And I'm going to show how it was permeated and normalized into everyday conversation and everyday life in Denton. So as Klan culture spread throughout the nation during the 1920s, various Klanish expressions were embraced at large in order to identify the order's membership as white American-born Protestants, a distinct citizenry of an invisible empire. And the order referred to this distinct citizenry as 100% Americans. This infamous phrase was prominent throughout Klan literature, and those 100% Americans incorporated the terminology at both local and national levels as a way of branding their Klanish identities. In Dallas, the local order started its own Klan journal called the Texas 100% American. Other Klan journals like Fort Worth's American Citizen and the National Order's Wisconsin Courier also regularly promoted to and for a 100% population. Now, this term was diverse in its presentation. It varied by numeric and spelled forms, but its use by Klans across America to represent the order's strictly white Protestant body of membership was universal. This terminology was often incorporated into Klanish business advertisements because the phrase allowed Klansmen to attract Klanish business while simultaneously imposing boycotts against anti-Klan competitors. You can see here on my screen, I've provided a couple of examples of these Klanish advertisements. You'll see the 100% Square Deal by Lone Star Gas Service, which was published in the Dallas 100% American magazine and journal. And on the other side, you'll see an ad for water drinkers from Mineral Water Depot, who advertises 100% pure water. And this was published in a Klan journal out of Fort Worth. And this is one of 30 in one publication. So again, this was standard Klan branding. And there are an abundance of Klan studies that have shown that the larger a Klan's size and influence in a particular area, the more prevalent its advertisements and communication campaigns, which in and of itself is a pretty logical deduction, right? More of a particular group, more of their language and rhetoric and influence within a community. So that said, my primary evidence and research suggests that membership in Denton's local order must have been considerable. Throughout the 1920s, the Denton Record Chronicle and other local publications were flooded with 100% advertisements, such as this one here on my screen from Klansman Bert Fowler, owner of Alamo Storage Company and Auto Supply House, who worked in a call to 100%ers in every single one of his company's advertisements in the Denton Record Chronicle between 1922 and 1929. From paints that improved a car's look 100% to an assortment of 100% pure products, he never missed the opportunity to brand his business as Klan business. One of Fowler's 1926 advertisements for Alma motor oil, which I have for you on the screen here, best characterizes this Klansman's crafty form. The simple ad, which appears on the screen here, includes only 4 lines of text, followed by the company's information. 2 bolded lines, positioned one over the other, read respectively, Alma motor oil, Pennsylvania oil. Below each of these bolded lines are 2 significantly smaller, lighter, and hardly noticeable lines of text. Read in concurrence, top to bottom, the full ad reads, Alma motor oil, 100% pure, Pennsylvania oil, sold and serviced here. So while the ad obviously insinuates that the garage sold and changed oil, the verbiage clearly reads awkwardly because oil itself is not serviced. Additionally, the obvious effort to make part of the text less noticeable should not be dismissed, as this is an effort that's pretty counter to the purpose of an advertisement, which is to clearly convey information. However, when the two bolded lines are read separately from the smaller discrete lines as they were intended, a very different message emerges. Amelie Motor Oil, Pennsylvania Oil, 100% pure, sold and serviced here. In just 4 simple lines, Fowler not only advertised the oils and services he offered at his garage, he also branded the business as one that was both owned by and for the clannish population of Denton. Similar advertisements flooded the Denton Record Chronicle throughout the 1920s and beyond. Filmhouse owner J.M. Vivian promised customers a 100% entertainment experience at his Princess Theater, which was also the first theater to debut the Birth of a Nation Klan film in Denton in 1915. City Commissioner and grocery store owner George Turner frequently advertised 100% products in his weekend sale ads. Bakery owner J.A. Holt, who also signed a petition calling for Quakertown's forcible removal, proudly promoted his business near the North Texas State Normal College, now known as UNT, as one that was with the 100%. Holt unmistakably knew his customer base, as clannishness thrived on the college campuses as well. The North Texas State Normal College of Denton, now known as the University of North Texas, became a state-funded institution in 1901. And by the 1920s, a co-ed student body from across North Texas and neighboring states packed its campus dorms by the thousands. Along with the young women from the nearby College of Industrial Arts for White Women, now known as Texas Women's University, the State Normal College student body helped shape early 20th century Denton into a thriving college town. But in a reciprocal exchange of influence, local clannishness helped shape campus culture as well. As early as 1920, an unorganized body referred to in the yearbook as a debating club, club spelled with a K, held unusual and irregular meetings in the campus chapel. It claimed an unchartered membership that was exclusive and extended by invite only to those who met certain unspecified but, quote, necessary qualifications. Without any documented parliamentary procedures, the only purpose of this club with a K was to promote work that was related to, as they state, remedying evils in Denton. So by 1921, this sort of occult, clannish activity became absolutely brazen. There was no need to pretend anymore. A 1921 article published in the school paper, the Campus Chat, called on several of the college's clubs to attend a baseball game between students and faculty. The Ku Klux Klan was among those specifically invited. Another Campus Chat headline from 1921 announced that a keen college Klan, all spelled with Ks, had marched through the campus. It described how, after the campus Klan, quote, dragged and burned a dummy in the middle of the street, they marched to the home of college president, Dr. Bruce, who, quote, caught the spirit of the occasion. A month earlier, during the height of the Quakertown removal campaign, a black couple from Quakertown, passing by the campus in their car, were pelted with rocks by a mob of male students. As 2 Denton police officers watched, the students smashed the couple's windshield and broken glass gashed the face of the woman inside. Though local reports documented that officers had witnessed the assault, charges were left, quote, pending until an investigation could be completed. I can confirm for you that there is no public record of any such investigation or charges. In 1921, Quakertown property owner Will Evelyn Woods was hired on as a janitor at the State Normal campus, but he stayed on only a short 3 months. In an oral history interview recorded decades later, Woods described multiple terrifying accounts of the types of Klan harassment he faced on the North Texas State Normal College campus. So from 1922 forward, the State Normal College yearbook entitled The Yucca serves like a chronicle of clannish development for the institution. In 1923, a thoroughly medieval theme loaded with chivalrous imagery, pretty typical of Texas clans, was incorporated with references to graduation gowns that were referred to as, quote, KKK uniforms dyed black. Likely a crude reference to the Quakertown community students had witnessed forced out of Denton earlier that year. The 1923 yucca concluded its last page with an image of a black man dressed in rags and running while being violently attacked by a dog. The 1924 and 1925 yucca also feature a collection of racist, quote, pickaninny and Ku Klux references made for the enjoyment of the white student body. This image that you see here on my screen is a cartoon that features the editor and co-editor of the yucca, and you can see they're dreaming. And there's an assortment of pretty standard things college students would dream of. One of them being a Ku Klux march. So calls for 100% loyalty and 100% ads were also pretty standard clannish advertisements that were featured throughout the 1920s editions of the Yucca Yearbook as well. I'm going to come back to those in a minute. But I want to address that while clannish culture on the state normal campus tended towards brashness, it was expressed at the White Women's College of Industrial Arts, as I mentioned before, now TWU, in a much more occulted and dramatic fashion. After Quakertown's removal was officially secured with the Park Bond election in the spring of 1921, the city's success was commemorated in the campus Dedalian yearbook. Incorporating the yearbook edition's overall Egyptian theme, the school memorial featured a full-page illustration of a black woman dressed in rags, stretched out on the ground in full prostration before an elite white master perched on a royal throne. This was how they opened their yearbook the year that Quakertown was removed. So in the midst of the Quakertown condemnation proceedings in the fall of 1922, the CIA student newspaper, The Lasso, published a recap of campus Halloween festivities, which included, quote, an ominous visit from the local Ku Klux Klan with their fiery cross. Later that December, The Lasso published a cryptic and subtle announcement on the front page. Incorporating the college mascot as a reference for the student body, the young Klanswomen declared, now that the White Owls have organized, the Ku Klux Klan should not run out of feathers. So while the 1920s Klan was undoubtedly a patriarchal organization, it is critical that we recognize the substantial role of white women in the order. Just as the UDC helped shape and encourage the second-generation Klan's revitalization via their mythical memories and lost cause legends, the women of the Klan, many of whom were also UDC members, continued to play leading roles as preservers and promoters of local supremacist culture. The 1920s Klan afforded these white Protestant women at large their own social setting, wherein they could celebrate and exploit their own racial and religious privileges. Mobilized by local leaders who tapped veins of racism that were already thoroughly established within the white Protestant community of Denton, these women were more a product of the ideas and values that influenced their community in the early 20th century than they were a deviation from them. Nearly all of the female Klan members that I've been able to identify were highly active in their churches as self-identified fundamentalists who were motivated by the apocalyptic language employed in Klan literature. They were entirely immersed in theologically rooted white supremacist ideologies, and they employed these in targeted campaigns meant to erode decades of increased public tolerance towards racial integration after the turn of the 20th century. As a matter of fact, I should point out that women made up a large portion of the local Klan membership, though their activities and ideologies suggest that their complex interactions between race, religion, and gender in American society It proves that our failure to recognize the prominent role of white women significantly reduces our ability to really understand the kind of influence and contribution that the Klan in general was able to have. So, women's Klans in particular coveted leadership opportunities where Klanswomen could lead as powerful organizers and wield power over political forces of influence through informal networks, meaning they sought to become members of many organizations because by spreading themselves out, they were able to spread and disperse their ideas and bring more people into a covert network of operations. So even those women who already had leadership positions in Denton found that the Klan afforded them new opportunities to further their already established racialized agendas. These women were no longer just the mere preservers of historical memory, because Klan membership allowed them to place themselves in the midst of their own myths of Ku Klux Confederate heroism, wherein they became active agents in a sacred battle to preserve white supremacy. As early as 1922, Denton Klanswomen served as leading figures in a campaign that targeted anti-Klan senatorial candidate James E. Ferguson. Led by R.J. Turrentine and Klansman J.W. Sullivan, Klanswomen gathered in their churches to write letters to Denton County voters and organize phone canvasses before the election. Together, they spearheaded an effort to facilitate a political takeover, an infiltration of the Klan to establish what they called a, quote, invisible government. So these Denton Klanswomen were even leading figures in the National Klan's coordinated interference in 1924 national elections. Commonly referred to as the Klan ticket, national Klan leaders worked through their respective state leaders to engage in a highly successful campaign of Klan politics that ensured only approved Klansmen made their way onto national primary ballots. In Texas, Klansman Felix D. Robertson was elected to run for governor, and Denton Klansman W.C. Edwards, the editor of the Denton Record Chronicle, was tapped as the Klan candidate for lieutenant governor. At the helm of local campaign efforts in support of Edwards and the Klan ticket at large was Klanswoman Mrs. H.F. Schweer, who was also a member of the Katie Daffin United Daughters of the Confederacy and the founder of Denton County's League of Women Voters. This in mind, it is important to note one prominent difference between Klanswomen and Klansmen, which is that women tended to be far less public in their Klanish endeavors than men. This devotion to privacy facilitated a Klanswoman's ability to seamlessly integrate into normal, everyday activities of white Protestant community, so they could continue to construct elusive webs of private relationships that carried devastating power. In particular, Klanswomen enacted what were referred to as poison squads or whispering campaigns, which were capable of triggering tumultuous events. Everything from mass consumer boycotts to violent, even deadly Klan attacks. One campaign in particular divided the CIA campus in a full-out war between pro and anti-Klan elements from the summer of 1925 through the following spring of 1926. Really, though, it all started in 1924 when CIA President and Klansman Dr. F.M. Braley died unexpectedly from the flu. As a member of the board of directors of the First Christian Church and one of the earliest proponents of Quakertown's removal, Braley was highly revered in the Denton community for his commitment to the white moral order. More than 2,000 people attended his funeral services at the CIA, which were conducted by Reverend J.W. Kearns of Waco, who for several months prior had campaigned for the Klan-dominated state Democratic ticket including a welcome speech for Texas Grand Dragon Z.E. Marvin when he visited Waco earlier that same spring. So as representatives of the two most clannish churches in Denton, as I discussed last week, Reverend S.M. Black of First Methodist and Reverend W.C. McClung of First Baptist assisted Reverend Kearns with the services. Music was led by J.W. Pender, a man heralded a year earlier in the State Normal College yearbook as the student body's favorite, quote, 100% American. Throughout the service, Kearns emphasized Braley's commitment to Christianity as a devoted, quote, citizen, an occulted reference to the CIA president's membership in the Invisible Empire, a title earned only by joining the Klan as a citizen. Attended by the most prominent Dentonites, many of whom were associated with local Klan activity, the funeral cortege was reportedly the longest ever seen in the city. The CIA Board of Regents began their search for Dr. Braley's replacement immediately. After a thorough examination of his character and achievements, the board unanimously elected Dr. Lindsay Blaney of Houston's Rice University, though he had never even applied for the position. The board's priorities were made pretty apparent by the summary of Blaney's character provided to the DRC, in which he was described as a, quote, Southerner, and a son of a distinguished Presbyterian clergyman. His volunteer service in World War I on the front lines, his title of lieutenant colonel, and assorted military decorations were considered of utmost importance for the job as president of the local college for white women. The Regents also noted Blaney's numerous publications in, quote, conservative magazines. As an active member of white women's heritage organizations with, quote, 5 uncles wounded or killed in the Confederacy, Blaney's wife was also deemed a perfect fit for the Denton community. Certainly, they were certain that Blaney would, quote, carry out the policies of his clannish predecessor of Dr. F.M. Braley. CIA Dean E.V. White afforded Blaney a personal endorsement and promised to secure the support and cooperation of the entire faculty and student body for his placement. In early October 1924, Blaney accepted his new position as president of the CIA with plans to start after his replacement was secured at Rice. In the days following Blaney's appointment and acceptance, former Texas Governor James E. Ferguson spoke at a CIA luncheon in support of his wife's current gubernatorial campaign. She was the anti-Klan candidate. After an introduction from Klansman and Baptist minister W.C. McClung, Ferguson spoke largely of current affairs with a promise that recent, quote, blights like hoof and mouth disease and the Ku Klux Klan would soon pass away. The DRC made no mention of Ferguson's visit or speech in Denton, but statements made by Ferguson the following day in Austin received front-page coverage under a headline that read, Ferguson to deny funds to institutions with Klan officials. Excerpts from Ferguson's Austin speech clarified that the governor had been traveling making speeches to promote a new zero-tolerance approach to address the Ku Klux Klan activism and membership deemed a rapidly growing plague within state institutions. Ferguson even declared that state education funds were not to be used to feed Ku Kluxism, and the governor warned that present state employees who identified as Ku Kluxers should see the, quote, error of their ways, lest it was too late. It's likely that this is the same message that was offered at the CIA the day prior, but was never reported or shared publicly. So Dr. Lindsay Blaney went on to assume his role as CIA president at the start of the new year in 1925, and much to his own detriment, he immediately set to work with attempts to modernize the institution. By April, the local Klan leaders realized they had made a huge mistake. Blaney, as it turned out, was staunchly opposed to the Ku Klux Klan. So Klanswomen on staff at the college went to work and began to spread rumors of his inability to run the school. When the president announced he was undeterred and planned to move forward with his plans to divide the college into 5 schools in order to support young women interested in academic subjects as opposed to just cooking and sewing classes, the local women's Klan called an unprecedented special joint meeting with the men's order, and Blaney became the center focus of a united Klan front determined to secure his removal. By September 1925, despite their unified praise upon his recruitment less than a year prior, Blaney was at the center of full-blown controversy as 2 of 5 CIA regents demanded his resignation. Board member C.U. Connell openly condemned President Blaney in the press and declared devout opposition to his modernizing policies. According to Connell, Blaney had abandoned, quote, the ideals and principles for which the CIA was founded, and he condemned his agenda as entirely out of line with that of the college's revered former president, F.M. Braley. He denounced Blaney's, quote, school of thought as wholly out of harmony with the faculties and, quote, the law under which the school was established, which apparently wasn't Texas law, but Klanish law. Denton's Klanswomen especially turned their gaslights on full force within the CIA. Faculty member Mrs. L.A. McDonald, whose husband also wrote for the Denton Record Chronicle, publicly lashed out against Blaney and started a petition among the female faculty which called for his resignation on account that he was, quote, mentally and temperamentally unsuited for the position. This man, with multiple war designations, heralded for his ability to think progressively, critically, suddenly was entirely incapable, mentally incompetent, because he was anti-Klan. So this Klanish conflict over the purpose of the CIA institution unfolded in daily press updates that reached across the state of Texas, most of which publicly publicized blatant personal attacks against Blaney. But the CIA president maintained his poise throughout the entire affair. When questioned by the press, he refused to speak negatively of the board while he was still employed at the college. His only public comment in the midst of the controversy was short and simple. He said, "The people of Texas can easily see who and what is behind all of this." Despite an overhaul of the college bylaws and continued attacks on his policies, Blaney maintained majority support of the CIA Board of Regents throughout most of September 1925, and he refused to leave so long as only a minority demanded his resignation. In response, the opposition front changed their approach, and attacks against Blaney became increasingly personal as accusations of inappropriate contact with female students began to swirl. As the tone became increasingly sinister, one pro-Klan publication out of Lockhart, Texas declared Blaney would be, quote, sacrificed on the altar of his own high educational beliefs. In the final week of October 1925, CIA Regent members C.U. Connell and Miss Sally B. Capps stepped up their personal public denunciations of Blaney and again called for his resignation. On October 28, 1925, Regent member Mrs. E.P. Turney publicly came to Blaney's defense and ordered a resolution to the board with a request for the resignation of faculty members involved in the Klanish uprising against the president. Mrs. Turner's resolution identified Mrs. E.V. White, college dean, Estrella G. Heffley, Dean of Women, W.R. Neighbors, CIA business manager, and R.J. Turrentine, head of the education department, as the Klanish actors responsible for unrest in the institution. Unsurprisingly, those identified were all involved and implicated in other local Klan activities. Every single one of them. So despite Mrs. Turner's attempt to dispel the Klan's hold over the CIA campus, her resolution was narrowly voted down, and Dr. Blaney finally submitted his resignation as president. In a brief statement, he said, I have suffered all that is humanly possible. After several months of silence following his forced ouster, Dr. Blaney finally made a full public statement. Though Klansman and DRC editor W.C. Edwards had repeatedly published articles with negative slants towards Blaney on the front page of the DRC for nearly a year prior, the former CIA president's statement was buried 8 pages deep. In his statement, Blaney summarized his short administration as a, quote, grim effort to withstand consistent harassment from clannish members of the board who inspired insurrection and dissension among the faculty against him. He detailed attempts of extortion by Klan members who demanded unwarranted pay raises, a vast misappropriation of state funds, and a clannish college faculty committed to, quote, outdated methods of instruction and scholarship for the purpose of preserving frivolous traditions. Rebuttals against Blaney's statement flooded into the DRC with, again, favorable front page placement, courtesy Klansman W.C. Edwards, and a new public battle of words commenced. Once again, buried deep beneath the headlines, 5 pages in, on February 20th, 1926, Blaney again spoke out and had the final but muffled word, accusing DRC editor and Klansman W.C. Edwards of promoting, quote, half-truths via his recent partial publication of a statement issued by Texas Governor Ferguson on Blaney's behalf. The former CIA president quoted Ferguson's letter in full with a demand that all of the facts be made available to local Denton citizens. In this letter, Texas's governor wholly condemned Blaney's forced ouster, as well as the, quote, false charges made against him. And she criticized the, quote, Ku Kluxers and zealots who instigated the upheaval against him. Governor Ferguson blatantly stated that Blaney was a victim caught in the, quote, crossfire of Klan and anti-Klan sentiments in Denton. She said, having taken a divisive stand against the Klan, Dr. Blaney incurred the enmity of that organization from the first days. It was a very studied campaign of malicious gossip that pursued him. Mr. J.W. Sullivan and Dr. Blaney even formed a friendship, but Mr. Sullivan is reported to be in the prominent ranks of the Denton Ku Klux Klan. Indeed, from the moment Blaney arrived at the CIA campus, Denton Klansman J.W. Sullivan was assigned to befriend the president and serve as an informant for the local order. When it became evident that Blaney was aligned to the wrong side of the moral order, he was marked as an enemy, and local Klanspersons unleashed their poisonous campaigns against his administration. Blaney's ouster served to further embolden clannishness at the CIA. And the organization grew to such a degree on the campus that the student Klanswomen became well-versed in the literature of the Women's Order. In the week following Blaney's resignation, a small message on the front page of the Lasso, the student newspaper, called on CIA students to embrace the spirit of, quote, America First. And a 1923 Women's Klan pamphlet entitled Women of America, which I've covered the front of here on the screen for you, America First is listed as one of the first of 3 paramount principles outlined for women of the order. But the organization at large regularly incorporated the phrase into their clannish communications and branding, as I've shown for you on the other ad here. America First. Sound familiar? America First. And it still exists today. So in the spring of 1927, the CIA College's new Braley Memorial Library was dedicated with ceremonies and a DRC commemoration that connected the former CIA founding president's memory with a Civil War lynching. According to the recollections of local Confederate veteran Boone Dougherty, an old oak tree at the northwest corner of the Braley Library was once a, quote, sentinel on Blue Surge Hill, where his family's farm existed in the spring of 1864, back in the days when, as he put it, punishment was made to fit the crime. In gruesome detail, the DRC published Dougherty's recollection of an enslaved man's lynching in that tree for supposedly sassing his master's wife. In relaying the story, Klansman and editor W.C. Edwards humored at the fact that half a decade later, tree limbs once, quote, so convenient for hempen neckties would serve to shade young white women at study in the gardens below them near Brayley's Memorial Library. The article made it clear. The location selected to commemorate the late President Brayley's memory was not haphazard. In fitting form, the following November, the Texas Federation of Women's Club, comprised largely of United Daughters of Confederacy members from Denton, the same women who led both the Confederate Monument fundraiser campaign and the campaign targeting Quakertown that forcibly removed all black residents from the inner city of Denton. They hosted their annual convention at the CIA. After the opening, quote, Southern dinner, the weekend program commenced with panel discussions on narrowly selected topics like, quote, the aristocracy of the Old South, and, quote, Southern ideals, and, quote, romance of the New South. Undoubtedly, the CIA campus was the perfect venue for this gathering of proud Southern women. So in this way, we can see how the Klan not only afforded white Protestant women political influence, it also facilitated a social community wherein they could express and celebrate their privileges in everyday life. In February 1926, Colonial Card Club, all spelled with a K, announcements began to appear weekly in the Denton Record Chronicle. Now, first, I'd like to point out that the Klan's tendency to use words that start with C and replace that C with a K, and the use of tri-K iteration was standard branding for the organization. For example, the Keene College Klan, all spelled with Ks, that marched through the North Texas State University campus, right? Or Dallas Klan's infamous 1924 Colossal Klan Carnival, all spelled with Ks. Furthermore, a review of any single edition of any Klan journal will reveal numerous advertisements with similar spelling alterations. So as an example of just how standardized this tri-K iteration was in Klanish language, I've also included here a dry cleaner advertisement published in a 1923 edition of the Dallas Klan Journal, 100% American. I cannot emphasize enough standard Klan branding. You can strike the word coincidence out. It doesn't have a role in this situation. So typically published on the women's interest page, Denton's Colonial Card Club, with its tri-K spelling, was coyly presented in the paper as one of many women's social clubs in Denton, most often as a bridge club, but parties, picnics, and even official meetings were announced under the moniker. Let me be clear, this club was not like the others. Similar colonial card clubs were formed in other North Texas communities that also had thriving Klan activity as well. At a 1923 gathering in Wichita Falls, the local paper described how the hostess, quote, very cleverly portrayed the club in the act of playing bridge. In Hobbs, New Mexico, a small community just across the Texas border, the local paper published the group's gatherings under a simple headline, KKK. So unlike other women's clubs that typically aim to show off high participation with detailed attendance lists that featured the names of its members, Denton's Colonial Card Club listed members and attendees only selectively. Additionally, guests were always identified as distinct from the group's membership, and prominent guests often even influenced the way the meetings were framed in publication. In such instances, if a prominent resident was in attendance and they wanted to note that attendance, the large bolded headline featuring the club's name was often spelled normally with C's instead of K's, with a conformational clannish spelling just a few lines into the fine print. Additionally relevant, Colonial Card Club members were all associated with other white supremacist and Klan activity in Denton, or they were directly related to someone who was. Many were also directly involved in Quakertown's removal efforts years earlier, and several were connected to notably large Confederate monument donations. So Denton's original women's Klan met under the guise of the Colonial Card Club regularly between February 1926 through the end of 1929. While the frequency of these meetings dropped during the 1930s, the Klanswomen still met no less than once a month for decades as late as 1939. By 1942, as many of the members began to pass away or age out, there was a noticeable decline as meetings became sporadic. One of their final gatherings was held in the Marquis Hall on the North Texas State Normal College campus. Around the same time, the Colonial Card Club meetings began to dwindle, and they had their last meeting in the Marquis Hall. The Kappa 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 sorority, also referred to as Tri Kappa sorority, was formed at the State Normal Teachers College as a, quote, social club for female students. In April 1940, the Tri Kappas hosted their first dance at the Women's Club in the all-white city park, built on the land where Black Quakertown residents were forcibly removed from nearly 2 decades prior. Before leaving the dance, all of the sorority's members were bestowed with a small gold pin in the shape of a knife with a crest that featured the letters KKK. The sorority continued to host their yearly dance at the Women's Club building with exclusive invitation from the local city federation and UDC. And in 1942, the young Klanswomen of the State College incorporated a Southern plantation theme for their spring rush dance, which included black doormen hired to announce their arrival, just as would have been done in the antebellum days. Let me be clear. There are a couple other Kappa 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 sororities that have been identified. There is no official national sorority with any kind of official history. But the only other ones that the two that I have been able to identify are both in towns with thriving Klan membership at the time, and they all form with the rise of civil rights demands. It's no different than the formation of a Confederate monument, a Kappa 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 sorority, who self-describe themselves as a social club of unspecified but, quote, restricted membership for girls living on the Normal College campus who maintained at least a C average. So their membership restrictions certainly weren't based on academic merit. Furthermore, the organization went out of its way to emphasize and employ the use of triple K references as often as possible. These young women regularly participated in racialized rhetoric and activities such as their 1951 Dolls on Parade minstrel stage performance at the college, wherein members painted themselves in full black body. I have a sample of that performance here on the screen today. In 1952, they required all Triple K pledges to host their own minstrel performance in full black body to prove their commitment to the sorority's values. This was the Campus Women's Klan. In 1954, the same year that the Supreme Court outlawed segregation in public primary schools and colleges, the Kappa 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 was no longer featured in the official university publications. This was the college Klan. So, by addressing the Colonial Card Club and the Tri Kappa sorority as clannish orders, we can see how white supremacist ideologies perpetuated through generational cultural norms. But quite frankly, one didn't have to be an official Klan member to participate in clannish supremacist activities in Denton. In 1926, the Denton Kiwanis Club, an organization dedicated to the youth program development in the community, hosted the first of many minstrel show fundraisers that would follow throughout the years. Hosted by Klansman and Kiwanis director Ben C. Ivey, the organization's 1931 minstrel entitled, quote, "A Plantation Night," was hosted in the State Normal College Auditorium with a program that featured an assortment of ads referring to black people with explicitly racial slurs and vulgar jokes meant to dehumanize them. It was reported that thousands of local Denton residents attended the performance to laugh at black caricatures and the demeaning narratives that were used to tell their history. The 1932 and 1933 minstrel show entitled The Colonial Days and A Cabin the Cotton similarly glorified the antebellum era of slavery with programs that featured the same vulgar and racialized language. Their turnouts celebrated just as large with records set. Unfortunately, this type of social harassment for the sake of white supremacist entertainment was the least harmful of the normative racist practices that evolved out of the 1920s Klan rebirth in Denton, as the civic oppressions were far more egregious. While poll taxes had largely served to prevent and suppress black voters in the area previously, when these poll taxes were outlawed, local officials had to come up with new creative ways to obstruct black suffrage. In June of 1934, W.E. Mann, the chairman of the Democratic Executive Committee for Denton County, sent notice to all of the area's precinct chairmen that black persons would not be allowed to vote in the upcoming primary elections that July. And he based this order on an announcement made by the Texas Attorney General James V. Alfred that federal law failed to specify that blacks could not be barred from the polls for party primaries, only main elections. So by preventing them from voting in the primaries, they hindered their ability to vote in the final elections. In an oral history recorded during the 1970s, Denton resident Norval Hill recalled how as a black child growing up in the 30s and 40s in the southeast part of town, where Quakertown residents had been forcibly relocated during the 1920s, there were just, quote, some places black people couldn't go. She identifies the courthouse square, in particular, the very place we all sit and share today. According to Hill, every fountain on the square had signs that read whites only, and none were available to black residents. Just a few years after Quakertown's forced removal, a county hospital was established, an effort largely instigated by the City Federation of Women's Club and UDC members that led the efforts to oust the black community. Unsurprisingly, black Southeast Denton resident Ruby Cole recalls in her oral history how even this hospital, the county hospital, was for whites only. All of the black doctors in Denton in private practice also refused to see black residents. There was a complete void in medical care because the black doctors in Quakertown left after the 2-year terrorization campaign inflicted on their community. So it wasn't until September 1944, when Dr. D.B. Whitehead opened his Elm Street Hospital and Clinic, that black residents finally could go to the doctor in Denton. He was the first white doctor to willingly see black patients. The Denton County Hospital refused to see black persons until after the Civil Rights Act. I'd just like to remind everyone that if you have any questions, I see a lot of you are taking notes, which is awesome. If you have any questions about anything I'm talking about today, or you'd like me to clarify a source, I'm happy to share them with you. So if you want to write those things down or post them in the event page, I will gladly share any source citation with anyone who's interested in looking at the primary documents that I've used to provide this information to you. So I just ask you to make a note of it. So another thing that I feel is important to address is that long after Quakertown's forced removal, prominent white citizens continued to celebrate how Denton's white elite, along with the help of the local Klan, decimated the black inner city community. If you see on my screen here, recently I discovered a postcard circulating on eBay. And upon realizing its significance, I began to look for more. Thus far, I've discovered and purchased no less than 13 prints of the same postcard commemorating Quakertown's forced removal. The earliest postcard I've identified thus far dates from February of 1938, it's postmarked, and that's about 15 years after Quakertown's forced removal. The latest postmark dates to December 1950, nearly 3 decades after black residents were forcibly relocated from the inner city. So on the front of the postcard here, there's a picture looking north towards the main building of the Texas State College for Women, now TWU. That's in the background. And the front of the postcard offers a view of the whites-only park built where Quakertown once existed. On the back of the postcard, a small commemoration reads, "This beautiful 27-acre park was once the principal Negro section of Denton, embracing some 5 city blocks. Through a bond election, this land was purchased and the Negroes removed to another part of the city." The handwritten message on the postcard that I've provided here today, postmarked December 1950, clearly exemplifies the sustained clannish influence on racial discourse and culture in Denton beyond the 1920s. Sent to a known Klansman named David Martin in Syracuse, New York, the unidentified sender suggests that the postcard offers a, quote, "cue of the cultural aspects of this lovely little town in Texas." And the writer notes how recent snowfall has served to make everything, quote, "nice and white again." I should probably also point out that these postcards were designed by local photographer and Klansman C.E. Carruth, who as early as 1923 began regularly incorporating tri-K iterations into his photography studio advertisements with bolded Ks. For instance, the state normal college students began incorporating blatant clannish rhetoric into their Yucca yearbook in 1921, at which point Carruth also deviated from his earlier ads, which before only referenced the word Kodak once. But from that point forward, after 1921, he began to incorporate the phrase Kodak, Kodak, Kodak along the top of his ads with bolded Ks at the beginning of each word. So by assessing the work of Klansman Carruth, we can see how the park that replaced Quakertown became itself an emboldening symbol for white supremacy and supremacist social civic ideals. In an oral history interview, second-generation Quakertown descendant Norval Hill reported how the park was indeed established specifically as a whites-only park, how blacks forcibly removed to Southeast Denton were not allowed to enter the park until late into the 1960s, and even then she recalls that access was limited, afforded only to, quote, special groups with pre-authorizations. A black reverend, Reginald Logan Sr., similarly described in his oral history how decades after Quakertown residents were removed, they had been not only exiled from their neighborhood that they had built for themselves, but also from the park area that replaced it until at least the late 1960s. So let's take a minute and just talk about the official desegregation narrative as published by the Denton County Office of History and Culture, the same authority in charge of contextualizing this Confederate monument, the entire courthouse lawn, and all of Denton County's history. On the county's official website, it states, and quote, Denton School Board voted unanimously to integrate its schools in August of 1963 by allowing its black students to choose whether to stay at their segregated all-black Fred Moore school or to go to any one of Denton's other white schools. The Office of History and Culture also states that by 1967, desegregation was, quote, complete, and that all black students had willingly, quote, assimilated into the previously all-white schools, which led to the necessary closure of the formerly all-black Fred Moore School. The county site also adds that while most students adjusted well, there were some, quote, community members who did not support integration. But community activists helped the process to be successful and quickly cultivated a diverse Denton community. The site also claims to offer historical context for how Denton's universities took steps towards integration, acknowledging that none of the private or public colleges that existed in Denton County admitted non-white students prior to 1956. Local authorities accurately identify Irma E.L. Cephas as the first undergraduate student to enroll at the University of North Texas that same year, and that it wasn't until 1964, nearly a decade after the Supreme Court ruled segregation in public schools as unconstitutional, that TWU's Board of Regents voted to integrate. What's missing from this local historical account is a full contextualization of the divisive and terrifying environment created in Denton by supremacists determined to resist integration efforts. For instance, shortly after the University of North Texas fully integrated in June of 1956 with the admission of 2 black women who were permitted to move into dormitories on the campus, a 6-foot-tall, gasoline-soaked Ku Klux Klan cross was burned on the lawn just outside of their building. The local narrative also fails to mention how by June 1963, 9 years after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled segregation in schools unconstitutional, only 209 out of the 850 Texas districts were integrated by any degree. While Denton announced, quote, voluntary integration the same year, publications in the local DRC at the time make it clear with regular appeasements to local whites that the decision was only announced to avoid federal penalties that were being placed on neighboring districts like Fort Worth, who continued to resist, and with clarifications that most of the black children were, quote, choosing to stay in their own Fred Moore school anyway. According to their own records, by December 1969, Denton ISD was, quote, still not in complete compliance of federal law as it faced its 3rd round of extension requests from federal authorities for its failure to completely integrate. December 1969. That's missing from our historical narrative. So in order to rectify this problem, the Denton School Board approved a new, quote, desegregation plan, which ordered the closure of the all-black Fred Moore School with the promise to open it later. The plan reassigned black teachers and students, requiring that they all be transported to other schools, despite what the local paper described as forceful and nearly unanimous opposition from the black community, who looked to the school as a landmark for their Southeast Denton community. A spokesperson for the black community who spoke at the school board meeting stated, quote, Negroes should not have to make the sole effort in achieving integration. The community as a whole has a responsibility to do so. Despite the pleas of a small interracial fellowship who called for converting Fred Moore into a 6th grade school for the entire district, and the school board's open acknowledgement that the Fred Moore building was more than viable, having been built in 1942, and with plenty of potential for further use, it was deemed unanimously that Fred Moore School would be closed and black children and teachers would be the ones to make the sole sacrifice for the sake of integration. Charles Williams, a black Southeast Denton resident born in 1955 to Norval Hill Williams Reed, whose family was exiled from Quakertown when she was an infant, offered vivid memories of this time during his oral history interview. He recalled how, as a child during local integration efforts, white men often drove through his neighborhood yelling at him and other children, calling them racial slurs, screaming verbal threats, throwing rocks. Williams was one of a group of 4 of the first black children admitted to Jefferson Davis Elementary, a school renamed after the UDC Confederate hero by UDC members. And Williams recalled how on his first day in school in the 3rd grade, quote, all the white kids stood outside the school just staring. He recalled how they looked at him as more of an object, more of an animal than a person. He also recalled how for the first time he held a new textbook, as the ones he had used at Fred Moore had always been full of other people's names and doodles, and before that he had just assumed that all children got used textbooks. And then he realized that new books had been available all along, just not to the black students. Williams also recalled how initially the black children were still segregated from the white children at the Jefferson Davis School. They were taught in different classrooms, ate lunch separate from the other students, and they weren't allowed to participate in playground activities. Rather, they were left to stand to the side and watch as the white children played in organized sports and games. These are the stories missing from our official historical narrative about integration in Denton. They're uncomfortable. They're sad. They're frustrating, but they're true. They're history. And by looking over them and by omitting them, we create an environment and we create a false reality that assumes it was easy, that integration just fell right into place here. Because as I mentioned last week, we can't have histories of oppression, because then we have to have histories of resistance. And histories of oppression make us uncomfortable. But the truth is, there's an entire demographic of people in this community who do know this history. They know it well because they lived it. Their parents lived it. Their grandparents lived it. It's not a secret for them. We live in two worlds with different histories, which shape completely different ontological views, which creates divides that can't be breached when we don't share the same version of reality. In May of 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Law, the most sweeping civil rights bill since Reconstruction. In response, several local white business owners expressed their frustration and dismay in the local press. Hood Barlow of Barlow's Cafe on the square said, "I don't like it, but I believe in obeying the law." W.D. Brown of the White House Cafe expressed his disdain without any acceptance or commitment to following the law. J.C. Birch of the Juicy Pig flat out refused to conform, openly expressed that he would not serve blacks in his business. At the same time, County Judge W.K. Baldridge refused to issue any official integration orders or corrective signage for restrooms or water fountains in public spaces like the local library. Southeast Denton resident Charles Williams spoke about these struggles as well in his oral history interview. As he recalled that McKinney Street served as the, quote, racial boundary in Denton, an invisible line that divided North Denton from South Denton, a line which blacks weren't allowed to go north of, just as the square served as a western boundary. Reverend Logan of Southeast Denton also recalled in his oral history how at the age of 16, around the year 1964, he worked at the Hickory House restaurant on University as a busboy. According to Logan, all the cooks, busboys, and dishwashers were black, while all the employees who dealt with the customers were all white, because of course, the customers too were all white. But he recalled how one day, a group of 20 or so young female students from the CIA, now TWU, I think it was TWU then, by then as well. So 20 female students from the women's college came in to eat at the counter. And after about half of the orders came in, a black woman in the group stepped up to place hers. But she was, of course, immediately informed that blacks weren't served there. So in response, the rest of the group canceled their orders and turned around to leave before the order ran out to beg them to stay, agreeing to serve the young black student. And Logan recalled his absolute bafflement that the young black woman not only ordered and was served, but she sat with her friends in the dining room at the very front of the restaurant. He said, quote, "She broke the veil." As afterwards, the restaurant began to permit its own employees to eat in the dining area versus in the kitchen, and they continued to serve black patrons. So while this incident was encouraging for young Logan, I have to tell you his oral history testimony further explains how, as a teen living in Denton, as a black teen living in Denton, well into the late 60s, even despite small victories like this, he continued to experience blatant and overt racism in Denton's public spaces, particularly right here on the main town square and in the business districts especially. Like many other black residents living in Denton during this time, Logan recalled how he went shopping for clothes and he would either be ignored as white customers were helped or overtly watched with suspicion and never offered help at all. Both the campus theater and the fine arts theater at the time still required that he sit in segregated seating, as all the black seats were limited to the balcony only. He recalled in particular how the streets in every part of town were so much better than those compared to the ones in Southeast Denton, his own neighborhood. As he put it, we lived in separate worlds, white and black. Southeast Denton resident Alma Clarke had similar recollections in her oral history interview. Clarke moved to Denton during the summer of 1962 to live with her husband, Willie Clarke, who was born in a Quakertown house that was relocated to Southeast Denton by his mother and stepfather, Maud and C.R. Hembry. According to Alma Clarke, it took, quote, years of activist efforts to get local retailers and restaurants to integrate, especially in downtown. She also recalled the poor condition of Southeast Denton streets, which remained entirely unpaved throughout the late 1960s. So in case I haven't made this abundantly clear by this point, I'd like to make sure everyone is taking home the message. Denton County's whitewashed version of integration history in Denton was written by a gaslight. The official narrative fails to account for the fact that during the mid-60s, city leaders also tried to forcibly remove black residents from Denton again. In April 1966, at the height of civil rights efforts in the area, as Denton schools still were in violation of federal integration requirements, the City Council called for an urban renewal hearing. And they started the first steps towards an urban renewal election, which would have authorized them to contract with the federal government for funds to improve 328 acres in southeast Denton. Now that sounds good at first, right? In an attempt to gain support for the endeavor, white leaders repeatedly used words, however, like slum and blight in the local press to describe the underserved black neighborhoods of Denton, which had not received a single dollar of civic investment since black Quakertown residents and their homes had been forcibly relocated to that area 40 years earlier, though they were tax-paying residents. So at a subsequent meeting held late May that same year, 85 black residents from southeast Denton addressed the city council and mayor to demand explanations as to why the city had failed to invest bond money into their communities, which was already approved by voters. Why did they need to go this extra step with urban renewal? Why couldn't they use the money that these taxpayers had already been paying for 40 years to make investments in their neighborhood? In response, Mayor Whitson at the time explained that the city, quote, held off on spending money in the area until larger solutions to the area's problems could be reached. And he promised residents that if the urban renewal measures passed, that at least $300 would be spent in their direct neighborhoods in southeast Denton. He said all the streets will be paved, have curbs, gutters, and all utility lines will be added. I want to point out that perhaps the most disturbing element of this promise is that it reaffirms what Quakertown survivors stated in all of their oral history interviews. 4 decades after black residents were forced out of their middle-class neighborhood that had paved streets, sewage, well water, all these modernized amenities that they had created for themselves. They're forcibly removed to southeast Denton, and 40 years later, they don't have power to all of their homes. They don't have running water. They still have to go outside and use holes in the ground because they don't have city sewage like everywhere else in Denton. And this is 1966. These narratives are missing from the official historical account. At the same May 1966 meeting, one bold southeast Denton resident expressed concerns about the renewal plan, which would rezone most of the area as industrial. And they asked whether this would result in evictions of black residents. Recalling the plight of his parents, he asked point blank, could people be forced out of their homes because of urban renewal? And the mayor admitted that yes, residents could and likely would in fact be forced out. And according to reports published in the DRC, the crowd of black southeast Denton residents erupted, though the mayor promised that any home, quote, up to standards would be allowed to stay. But those whose homes weren't would have various methods of help available. The southeast Denton residents remembered what local civic help looked like. Disappointed and in disbelief that they were facing an eviction situation near verbatim to the Quakertown removal, many black residents cited the amount of taxes that they paid, and they again demanded to know why couldn't the city use those funds to pave their streets, to make improvements. The mayor then claimed that the investments hadn't been made because not enough residents in the area could afford the necessary assessment fees. Gaslight. In response, southeast Denton residents said, well, how about you give us more job opportunities? How about you give us equal pay for the same work that white people do, and then we'd be able to afford those assessments. The city refused to have that conversation. So as Southeast Denton residents continued to publicly denounce urban renewal plans during the first week of June 1966, the county's White League of Women Voters facilitated a caravan tour of the Southeast Denton community, which they promoted as a, quote, tour of the tarnished corner of Denton. So at the same time, the City Council met with members from the directly affected community to plan for the appointment of an urban renewal made up of local residents. At the same time, the City Council met without members from the directly affected community to plan for the appointment of an urban renewal board that would be made up of local residents who would supervise the entire development process under urban renewal. Now, this board was to include several prominent positions, including an executive director, a deputy director, an executive secretary, a clerk typist, a rehabilitation officer, a relocation officer, an abundance of positions, all which were quoted to be handsomely paid positions. None of them were offered to Southeast Denton residents. As a matter of fact, they didn't even discuss this panel in response to Southeast Denton residents when they asked, how about we have the opportunity for better jobs? It seems like the perfect opportunity to respond with this board and give the residents of a community directly impacted by the urban renewal an opportunity to have say and input. That never occurred to white elites at the time. So over the course of the next month, hundreds of black residents spoke out in person at City Hall meetings and in the local press, comparing the plan to the same that had forcibly removed black residents from the inner city community 40 years earlier. And white officials largely dismissed the claims and concerns. However, because of Southeast Denton's community's commitment to forcing and focusing the local press on the issues, a small minority of white property owners in the area also caught wind of the city's plans, and it was only after their condemnations were hyped in the local press that other prominent citizens began to speak ill of the renewal plan. On July 17, 1966, the urban renewal election brought out the largest voter turnout in Denton municipal election history by that time, with a total of 3,554 votes, 2,933 against, 561 for. Mayor Warren Whitson and other city officials immediately took to the press to condemn and blame the, quote, attitudes of the Negroes in Southeast Denton who ruined their plans, and the city officials promised that Southeast Denton would have the most to lose for its interference. A year later, in September 1967, after black Southeast Denton residents used their power of voice and suffrage to defeat the local white elite's plans to forcibly remove them from their neighborhood, and as the city faced increasing pressure from federal authorities for still not being fully in compliance with the Civil Rights Act and school integration requirements, the City Council decided to begin developing its first housing code enforcement program, designed so that officials could forcibly remove, quote, dilapidated structures without any compensation at all for the structure or land that could be claimed in the black community. However, after meeting with federal officials, the new mayor, Zeke Martin, was forced to accept that the city's plan could not be legally executed. But it's important to understand is that the fears expressed by black residents towards the city's initial urban renewal efforts were more than justified. Because the plan was never about helping the black community. It was always about bringing in federal funding to improve Southeast Denton after forcibly removing black residents again. Had the city officials succeeded, Denton would have not only had to stop worrying about meeting federal integration reforms because the majority of the city's black children would be gone because they predominantly lived in Southeast Denton, they wouldn't have to worry about complying with the Civil Rights Act either. In the years that followed, race relations in Denton saw minimal improvements. as by the spring of 1969, black resident students, in particularly, increasingly demanded equal rights protections in the community. The Afro-American Student Organization was formed at the North Texas State University, now UNT. After a series of campus rallies throughout February of that year, the organization's president, James Frank Wyman, published a list of demands in the campus newspaper on behalf of 600 black students who he argued were, quote, inflamed by their conditions and daily treatment on campus. The following April, the Afro-American Student Union joined alongside the campus's Students for a Democratic Society and the Radical Caucus of Young Democrats in a march and demonstrations in front of the city police station to protest an officer's assault of a 17-year-old black freshman at the university named Brad Young. According to Young's account published in the local press, the young student voluntarily visited the police station per their request to discuss a marijuana investigation. During questioning, a sergeant struck him across the face so hard he was knocked from his chair to the floor, which resulted in significant, quote, corneal injury. Police Chief Wayne Autry confirmed with reporters that there was in fact a, quote, slight altercation, but that, quote, the boy underwent no serious injury. Student protests against police brutality lasted several days in Denton, with hundreds marching through the streets from the university to the police station as black voices called for an end to police brutality, as well as more police education and a civilian review board for the local officials. Members of the press reported that at least 300 persons protested over the course of several days. Autry himself held a news conference afterwards and declared that some of the leaders of the protests just sought to advocate radical changes in the government at all levels. It was a conspiracy. Not 1 month later, on Monday, May 26th, 1969, two separate racially motivated shootings occurred on the Texas Women's University campus, which left 9 students shot, 2 seriously wounded. This story is missing from the official narrative. According to official accounts, a rookie officer, white officer, only 6 weeks on the force, named Ricky Wiley, responded to a, quote, minor traffic accident in front of TWU's Hubbard Hall after a black man accidentally bumped a car parked in front of him that was unoccupied in a parking lot. Upon Officer Rick Wiley's arrival, he discovered George Allen Miles, a 22-year-old black man who was an active airman stationed at Carswell Air Force Base. He was in the driver's seat of the involved vehicle. Upon Wiley's arrival, he immediately called for backup, and a second officer arrived. They ordered Miles out of the car, and after a prolonged period of time, Miles expressed concern that he needed to get back to base, and he asked for the information that he needed so that he could leave. It was just a minor, it wasn't even a fender bender. The front end of his car made the mistake of touching the back end of an unoccupied white woman's car. Officer Wiley told Miles to wait. Now, the official narrative further asserts that at this time, Miles was instructed to step back away from Officer Wiley, to which Miles responded that he did not have to, and after several commands to, quote, get back, the second officer grabbed Miles by the arm and attempted to put him back in his car, at which time a, quote, altercation occurred. The official narrative states that the rookie drew his service revolver in an attempt to hit Miles with the butt of his gun, but he missed, striking his own arm, causing the pistol to discharge and strike and severely wound 2 black girls watching nearby. Miles was arrested and charged with carrying a prohibited weapon, a club of about 18 inches long later found in his vehicle. He was also charged with aggravated assault on a police officer. After he had been removed from the scene about 30 minutes later, as a cluster of bystanders were still gathered in the location, a pickup truck with 2 white men drove by and fired shotgun blasts into the crowd, hitting mostly blacks in attendance, 7 in total. As news of the event spread across town, local residents and police were all on high alert. Before the night was over, 13 more black persons were arrested and jailed. 9 of them students. 4 young black men were charged with carrying a prohibited weapon after police pulled them over and discovered a .38 caliber pistol in the car. One of these men was Frank Wyman, leader of the Afro-American Student Union at the North Texas State University, who had worked tirelessly in the months prior to organize against police brutality. 5 more young black men were arrested for, quote, suspicion of attempted arson after police claimed to have found parts of Molotov cocktails in their car, and another 4 young black men were taken into custody on similar spurious charges. All of these arson charges were later thrown out by the courts for a complete lack of evidence. So in one evening in Denton, Texas in 1969, after a white officer responded to a fender bender and assaulted a black man in custody by trying to hit him with the butt of his gun, causing it to fire and seriously injure 2 innocent bystanders, then after 2 white men showed up to enact racial retribution and fired shotgun rounds into a crowd of black people, injuring 7 more innocent bystanders, Denton police spent the entire night stopping, searching, and arresting black people. Sound familiar? Two weeks later, on June 4th, 1969, the 2 white shooters in the pickup truck were charged with assault with intent to commit murder and then released after posting $5,000 bonds each. George Miles, the military officer who parked his car too close to a white woman's, was charged with aggravated assault against a police officer and carrying a prohibited weapon, and still sat in jail with a $1,500 bond on each account. So his total bail was $3,000, only $2,000 less than the 2 white men charged with intent to commit murder. When Miles went to trial 2 weeks later, he pled guilty to aggravated assault against a police officer by waiving his right to enter a plea before the grand jury. His weapons charge was, of course, dropped for a lack of evidence. He was sentenced to 30 days in jail, and his trial was covered on the front page of the DRC, and I can assure you his trial by press was far more harsh than his official jail sentence. The following week, after hearing testimony from more than 33 IDing witnesses, Thomas Jeff Sparks and Grady Russell, the 2 white men charged with assault and intent to commit murder, who fired into the crowd of predominantly black TWU students, were no-billed by the grand jury, released without charge or bond. Their trials were barely mentioned in a small blurb 5 pages deep in the DRC. The following year, Officer Rick Wiley, the officer who attempted to assault Miles with the butt of his gun and who seriously injured 2 black innocent bystanders, was sent to attend a 10-week basic course in applied police science at the Regional Police Academy in Arlington, his first round of official on-the-job training. A year later. In September 1971, Wiley was promoted, not even a year after the shooting. Wiley was promoted from street patrol to the Criminal Investigation Division. Less than another year later, on May 1st, 1972, Wiley was promoted to a detective. On September 21st, 1973, barely 4 years after his careless and racially motivated actions spurred the violence that I just described to you. Wiley was promoted to sergeant in the Denton Police Department. He was rewarded for a job well done. George Miles, on the other hand, the black man who originally was involved in the car incident, he never incurred another charge on his criminal record. He went on to serve honorably in the Air Force for decades thereafter. Frank Wyman, the president and founder of the North Texas State University's Afro-American Student Union, who worked tirelessly for racial equality and social justice throughout his time in Denton, moved away and never incurred another charge on his criminal record. Thomas Jeff Sparks and Grady Russell, however, the two white men who fired their shotgun into the crowd of predominantly black people that day, they both went on to incur multiple additional violent charges and have rap sheets longer than this table. This is one story that I've shared with you today of many that I've collected that are not part of the official narrative of the civil rights era integration and segregation in Denton. And this story of the TWU shooting truly sums up the nature of the civil rights era in Denton as a whole, in which activism was predominantly motivated by a younger demographic of students who wanted a better future, while local black families continued to fight for their most basic rights, like their children's access to free, integrated public education, while simultaneously fighting the efforts of local officials who sought to forcibly remove their community from the city for the second time in less than 40 years. The truth is, Denton has made very little progress. The majority of its black and brown residents are still largely confined to segregated areas of the city where imaginary but commonly understood lines define the boundaries of racial division. This is a city where many black and brown persons don't feel welcome on the square because while many whites might tolerate their presence out of legal obligation, they simultaneously endeavor to preserve old traditions that they know will evoke fear and that serve to preserve white supremacist ideals. Today, predominantly young protesters from the local universities will continue to march against police brutality in Denton streets. Nearly 50 years later after the TWU shooting, they will demand the same changes from local authorities, while most Southeast Denton families will continue to remain in their neighborhood where they feel safest. In the area of Denton, which continues to see the least amount of investment from the city, while it is increasingly surrounded by jails, police stations, and industrial development. The narrative is now literally textbook. So leaving here today, the main facts that I want you to understand is that by the end of the 1920s, as Klan leadership faded nationally, local Klan leaders still remained the prominent cultural and political influencers in Denton, and they continue to perpetuate their distinctly racist ideologies. Denton is, as my good friend and colleague Chelsea Stallings says, a microcosm of the South. This story is not special. Denton's story is not special. This is the history of so many towns. But when we break it down on a local level, we can really see it. And white citizens in particular have an obligation to know this history. Most persons of color in Denton know this history because, as I said before, they and their families have lived it. It has been dumbed down and simplified for our comfort, for white comfort. So I hope that you'll take some of this information with you and share it, especially with other white people who need to know it. Put pressure on your local officials to tell the whole story. Because in Denton, white civic identity and patriotism were redefined by clannish rhetoric that normalized supremacist ideologies and discourse with counter-historical narratives that are still being employed right now through generational white power, and they continue to sustain control over localized sociocultural and theopolitical institutions. Klan culture still lives here. They don't wear white pointy hats and robes anymore. They wear business suits and ties. But the culture still thrives. The rhetoric is the same. So by understanding it, learning more about it, we learn how to recognize it and expose it for what it is. So that when we hear our elected officials or institutional leaders, we can call them out and we can demand that they broaden their own palette. We can look at ourselves and think about the language we use and question, where did that come from? And think about the kinds of set forms of reality that language establishes, because language is powerful. Language creates reality. So I think I'm going to stop here. I went a little longer than I should have last time, but it's 3 o'clock, and I'd like to give a little time to questions. If anybody has any questions, I would encourage you to either write them down or put them in the Facebook event real quick, and I'll be happy to answer those if you'd like me to address them here. Anybody have one? Can you just plug it into the Facebook event? Do you mind? Okay, that's fine. You can give it to Chelsea here. Just write it down and I'll answer it. We're trying not to share microphones today. If you could just write it down, that'd be great.
Basically, I was just noticing that K is the 11th number, and if you put 3 together, you got 33.
Yeah, that's a really good question. You will see a lot of, ironically, yes, you're right. K is the 11th number. That's what he asked about. So he mentioned that K is the 11th number in the alphabet. And he said you add them all together and you get the number 33. And he's asking if there's any significance to that. Sure, I have no doubt that there are Klansmen who have employed that type of rhetoric. I have seen some 33 references in Klan advertisements, which I assume, like you, is where that comes from. I haven't seen enough of it to a degree that I devoted any sort of focused attention to it in my research, because it just wasn't something that was so prevalent and prominent that I felt comfortable equating with the movement. And I refer to the Klan as a movement. There's been a lot of discourse among Klan scholars and historians about not looking at the Klan as this official national order, very structured with local groups, right? If you were here for my lecture last week, I talked about that a lot, how clannishness was a movement, it's a cultural movement, it's a social ideology, this idea of clannishness, which embodies white supremacist, southern supremacist culture that is eventually carried up into the North later on when the Klan rebrands Americanness, right, during the 1920s. But you will see the number 11 used. A lot of white supremacists today will sport a peace, it looks like a peace sign, but it's actually closed for the number 11, which would represent a K. Anybody else have a question? No. All right, well, you guys, I would like to tell you that I really appreciate all of you coming out, and again, I hope that you can take some of this information home with you and share it with those who need it. We will have a video up of the presentation later. And again, you can look for my thesis here in about a month. It should be released from the university. And if you want to follow up, you can always post questions in the Facebook event. I'm happy again to provide any source citation. If there's anything in particular I mentioned here today that you'd like to personally research more, I'm not a citation hoarder or source hoarder. I will share everything I have and tell you exactly how to find it, because I think history should always be public and accessible. All right?